Hi everyone and welcome. I'm preparing to feed my European nightcrawlers, and I just thought I would grab the camera and bring you guys along for the ride. The feeding's nothing special. It's going to consist of some kitchen scraps, as usual. You've got a variety of different veggies and fruits, mostly fruits on this go around. And another staple item that often gets included in my feedings is this little carton full of used coffee. So I've got a couple containers over here. The bag that you see over here is the VermiBag Mini, which at this point is 576 days old. That's pretty old, and it equates to something in the neighborhood of about 82 weeks, I believe. So when I did the calculation, it equaled 52 plus a pretty round number, which I believe was 30. So a year and 30 weeks. So year and a half old, more than a year and a half old at this point. And I've also got some other numbers written down over here on the right, which shows the number of feedings that the bin has received. So believe it or not, that 71 over there represents 71 feedings that have gone into that VermiBag Mini. And over that time, that equates to one feeding every 8 days or so. And over here in this much newer container, which is only 54 days old at this point, and that's what, maybe a month and a half old at this point. So far this container has received 8 feedings, and that equates to one feeding almost every week. So today they're going to both get fed, and since both bins have a pretty abundant amount of bedding in them, I don't think I'm going to add bedding. I don't know, we'll see when we get there. But as I remember, I added fresh bedding to this container here last week. I don't know, maybe we'll add a little bit if we see the need to, but right now I'm only planning on adding food. I don't even think I'm going to add grit today, because I think I added grit pretty recently as well. So let's get to work on this. Now that it's winter time, the heat has been turning on a lot lately, and whenever the heat's running in my house, maybe it's just an effect of the forced hot air, the air definitely becomes fairly dry in the house. So without those plastic coverings, I think that the top surface of this bin would be quite dry. And out here on the corners, it is pretty dry because there is a little bit of airflow getting around that piece of plastic. But right beneath the plastic, the moisture level is really nice. And it does look like the worms have been enjoying the moisture up here, because you can see them hanging out right up here on top, cruising around within the bits of paper that rest out here. And a lot of these castings that I see deposited on the paper are also newly added, because I believe last time too I took a look at the video from last time I fed, and it did seem like, you know, by handling the paper, a lot of the castings that had been stuck to the paper last week had dropped off. So I'm pretty sure a lot of the stuff we're seeing attached to the paper is fairly newly deposited. I think also, similar to the observation last week, the castings right here on the surface look really nice too. I think, you know, with the moisture being sort of focused right here, all the moisture that tries to escape out of the bin but gets caught by the plastic and creates a little bit of a terrarium effect, ends up being the spot in the bin where the worms really enjoy hanging out. Let's see if we can keep these worms from trying to crawl out. I don't think the worms generally want to crawl out of the bin. But when I'm in here working on the bin, that's when I sometimes observe the worms seemingly wanting to climb a little bit. All right, so I'm gonna drop in today's feeding, but I also like to, if possible, see how the previous feeding is holding up. If I'm not mistaken, last week's feeding consisted of some sort of soup greens, like maybe, I don't even know, some sort of carrots or something. I think there were some chunks of broccoli in there too. And then on top of that, fresh feeding went some of the older bits of leftovers that we observed from previous feedings. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was banana peels that ended up being placed on the very top. And I thought I just saw something that resembled banana peel. It's kind of hard to tell after a while. But after a few weeks, you know, it's not surprising that it's almost unrecognizable. So like here's the stem of a banana peel. The stem will always take a little bit longer because it is a much tougher substance than the peel itself. Here, this might be the shell of a mango seed. So these are just little scraps from older feedings going back further in time. It would seem like the most recently added stuff, which should have been right around here, has for the most part been consumed. So I'm not seeing anything that would resemble broccoli stems. Although some of this might be leftovers from last week's feeding. So in 7 days, it seems like they've done a pretty decent job breaking down the stuff that was placed in here last. You can see a number of worms hanging out in here. I'm also seeing little bits of carrot, and I believe carrot was also part of the menu last week, so I'm starting to see signs of that as well in here. Oh yeah, bread. That's what I was curious of. I'm seeing little bits of white stuff with mold all over it, and that's got to be the bread. I expected to see more of that. I'm a little surprised. In the past, I've observed bread taking a little while to break down in the bins, but maybe here it's seen as more of a delicacy and has been broken down almost completely from what I can tell. Okay, I've actually created quite a deep pit here. Probably a little more space than we really need. So let's go ahead and drop in today's feeding. This is a plantain. Looks kind of like a banana, but it's not exactly a banana. There's also some forbidden food in here, although I think that the peel of an orange or a tangerine isn't really going to be as acidic as the meaty portion of the fruit. But they usually say, you know, you want to limit the amount of acidic foods that you put into your worm bins if possible. Some of the other stuff that we've got down here are some old grapes and half of a peach and a banana peel and a couple other random things. So it's a nice little mix of mostly fruits in here, which I believe the worms are going to appreciate. So let's, oh, there I go again, doing what I always seem to do. I don't know why, but I always seem to forget to add the coffee. So I'm going to try to not forget. Let's put in the coffee. Ooh, that's quite a generous portion. But I don't think that's a problem. I think the worms are going to appreciate it, hopefully. And we can start covering up this feeding area. Huh, stuff out here on the edge feels a little bit dry. I want to be careful not to let the dry winter air affect the overall dampness in this container adversely. I'd want to make sure that if things in here begin to dry out too much, that I account for that and compensate. And that's the one thing I've felt recently, is that the material in this bin might seem a little bit drier than it needs to be. So I've actually thought about maybe coming in here with the squirt bottle and applying a little bit of moisture. But every time I come in here and I initially remove that plastic covering and I see the moisture collecting on the bedding materials that I have scattered across the top, I usually feel pretty much at ease with the level of moisture, knowing that there's enough moisture, at least on the top surface, that it's drawing a crowd and that the worms are hanging out and enjoying the moisture that's kind of collecting on the paper on the surface. And I'm sure that if things were very, very dry elsewhere, and if that was the only game in town for moisture, there'd be a lot more worms on the surface. So I'm sure the worms are just as comfortable down within the bed, and that the moisture levels everywhere in the bin are probably adequate. And the fact that my glove stays fairly dry the way it does here, without any stuff sticking to it, I think that's also pretty clear evidence that we're definitely not too wet, which I believe is clear here. I just don't want to get too dry either. I'm trying to keep stuff in balance. So it's just one of the things I've been watching lately, but I think we're in good shape here. So let's cover up and we can head on over into the other container and get the other tub of European nightcrawlers fed. So yeah, after being in service for well over a year and a half, that VermiBag Mini probably is due for a harvest one of these days. I just need to keep reminding myself of that. I get reminded of it by a lot of people in the comments section too. People suggesting that, you know, you don't want to let the stuff go too long. I believe it's even the recommendation of Tom at VermiBag to not let the material in the bin go for too long, because then it just starts to get overly broken down, and that's not as good a thing as if you pull the material out while it's still a little bit more fresh. A lot of this paper was placed on top fresh last week, so a lot of this is still only a week old. Very clean, as you could tell in certain spots, but also littered with worm castings in other places. So that's always a good sign. I always hope that the material on the surface of my bins is a place that the worms feel pretty comfortable hanging out in. Sometimes I'll only put a piece of newspaper, just one sheet of newspaper on top, which pretty much serves the same purpose as a sort of a catch for the collecting moisture that accumulates on the plastic that rests on top. And then it, you know, it also becomes sort of a cool spot to spot worms right when you first come into the bin as well. The one thing I did do a little differently though when I covered up with the plastic a week ago was that you might have noticed the edges of the plastic were folded in a little bit, and the objective of that was to allow this bin to start airing out a little bit and drying off, because we did start noticing that the level of moisture down within this bin seemed a little bit higher than it needed to be. So the idea there was to not entirely remove the plastic coverings, but just, you know, reposition the plastic coverings in a way that allowed for a little bit extra airflow to allow for the edges of the bin at least to dry off a little. And I believe here on the edges we are starting to see signs of the material drying out a little bit, but it is fairly damp once you come in just an inch or two. But like right here on the very edge, you could see it's fairly dry. Right down the middle is where we last fed. And I thought I saw some signs of the bread already. The bread, usually when you put bread into a worm bin, it just gets overrun with mold. So even though here I kind of broke it in half and you could see the white color of the bread inside, what you see on the outside, you can see little traces of green and even a brighter color white, which is all mold also. And that's all stuff that the worms appreciate. So, you know, the mold is helping to break the material down, and then the worms come along and take advantage of that mold by eating that. So it's all connected. I'm starting to see some signs of the previous feeding other than the bread. Here's more of that moldy bread attached to a mango seed, or at least the shell of a mango seed. The seed itself might have been consumed by this time. The other thing I was starting to see signs of down low here are the kitchen scraps that were fed last week. It does seem like there's a fair bit of it. I just don't want to lose track of this mango seed. I usually try to keep track of the food items that I pull out of the feeding area so that I can return them down into the feeding area and cover them up so they're not out on the surface and attracting pests and insects. This, I believe, is probably another shell of a mango seed. Put that right there with the other one. So I'm trying to remember now. I did watch the video from last week to refresh my memory. It's a banana stem, banana peel stem. So, you know, like I said earlier, these bins were fed broccoli stems. That's what we've got a piece of right here. And I think we can see some traces of the orange color of the carrot shavings that were placed in here as well. And it is just little traces here and there. It doesn't seem to be any sort of a significant amount. So it does seem like they've done a pretty decent job breaking down the portion that they were allotted a week ago. This, I believe, is just another chunk of mango seed. So I think we could certainly continue to use this bedding material, this paper, as sort of our foundation for today's feeding. See, there they go again, trying to climb out of the bin. So I'll just spread it around, but try to at the same time fluff it up a little bit so it's not all just resting as a flat layer up against the bottom of the plastic of the bin. Although it probably just gets squashed right down as soon as I bury everything, so it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But I like this as the foundation for the feeding, because as the food starts to get broken down, it it'll drop its juices and not just form a puddle on the bottom, but it'll soak that paper and make that paper just as appealing for the worms later. So hopefully they'll consume that as well. I'm feeling like I might want to just grab a couple chunks of the stuff that floats out here on the top surface to sort of boost up that foundational bedding underneath the feeding area. And then we could drop in today's feeding. So yeah, let's dump that in, and we can start peppering in the old food scraps that we located on the way in. This is all almost exactly the same stuff, so when I threw a couple grapes into the container to feed the other bin, I threw a couple in here too. Same story with this banana peel, same story with this chunk of peach here. And I've taken out the peach pits in each case. Oh, look at this. Let's get these little guys back in. They definitely don't like it when I'm in here feeding. They don't like the interruption. And in these little shallow bins, it's really easy to have one of these little guys get right up to the top edge and make their way out if you're not careful. So I don't want to have any of them end up on the table or on the floor and out of sight, where they can get into some serious trouble. By that I mean drying out and dying. Wouldn't want that kind of trouble to befall my little worm friends. Oh geez, I almost did it again. And it's at this point I still feel like I could recover from it, because if I can still see the feeding area, I can still add my coffee. So I'm still technically feeding. But a lot of times when I forget to add the coffee, and I've already covered things up at that point, I don't let myself re-excavate the feeding area. At that point it's just a missed opportunity, and I blame myself for not using the opportunity to compost down my collection of coffee. But here I managed to catch myself before I forgot again. If you watch yesterday's video, I could put a link to it up here in the corner. I do that pretty regularly, but most recently it was yesterday's feeding of my African nightcrawlers, where I completely forgot to feed them any of the coffee that I bought down here for them. So it's just sort of a little running joke, I guess, because it's a pretty regular occurrence that I just sort of, I don't know why, completely forget to do it sometimes. This, what's this? It's also a, yeah, it's the seed of a mango, or the shell of a mango seed. I recognize it because of its texture, but I also recognize the holes that I punched into it to try to help its breakdown process along. So I'm just going to sink that down into there as well, along with the rest of the food. Alrighty. I'm going to try to focus a lot of this this paper closer to the center, because I believe I'm going to stick to the game plan, is trying to give this bin a little bit more of an opportunity to continue evaporating away some of its excess moisture. Because even though it's not too bad, at this point. It does seem to me like it might be a little bit more damp than it needs to be. So I'm just going to allow it at least another few days to continue drying by not completely covering the outer edges of the bin. So I just want to create a nice area for the moisture to recirculate in the middle and land on that collection of shredded paper in the middle. And that'll become sort of a nice little hangout for the worms. And at the same time, the outer edges of the bin will have a chance to dry off a little bit through evaporation. Okay. Let's see if I can cover this up in a way that it keeps the plastic where I left it. Okay. So yeah, you know, that's usually the telltale for me, at least, is when I see the material from the bin sticking to my glove. That to me is sometimes a indicator that maybe things are a little bit more damp than they need to be, and that maybe I should make efforts to help dry things off a bit. So that's my European night crawlers, all taken care of and fed after another week's time. And this was not a very large feeding, so I'm assuming that in another week's time I'll probably be back in here to give these guys a little bit more food. So so for now we're good to go. I'll take care of cleaning things up and putting things away, but I'll do that once I've turned the camera off, because that stuff's boring and I won't take your time with that. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your company. If you enjoyed the video, as always, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. That's really appreciated, and if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care.